Natalie is 26. From the outside, everything checks out. Stable income, her own place, a solid group of friends, and a life that looks genuinely put together on Instagram. But every Sunday night, before the week even starts, this wave of dread crashes over her. Not about anything specific, just everything. She cancels plans she was looking forward to. She overthinks text messages for 40 minutes. She cries sometimes and genuinely cannot explain why. Her mum keeps saying, "You have nothing to complain about." Her friends think she's being dramatic, and the cruelest part is that Natalie agrees with them. She keeps telling herself she should be fine. She has no excuse, but she's not fine. And she's not alone. Walk into any major city right now. Sit in any coffee shop, any office, any yoga class. The number of women quietly white-knuckling through their days, functioning on the outside while something quietly fractures on the inside, is staggering. This isn't a niche problem. This isn't a generational weakness. Something real is happening, and it has real explanations. Here at Brutal Relationship, we skip the comfortable surface-level takes and go straight to what's actually going on underneath. That's the only conversation worth having. Now, before we go further, this isn't a video about blame, not pointing fingers at men, at feminism, at technology, at any one thing, because the reality is more complicated and more interesting than any single villain. What's happening to women's mental health right now is the result of multiple pressure systems colliding at the same time, and when you understand each one clearly, everything starts making sense in a way that actually helps. Let's walk through it. Being expected to be everything, all at once. Here's a question. What does the ideal modern woman look like according to everything around you? She's professionally driven, ambitious, focused, building something. She's also warm and emotionally available for the people she loves. She's attractive and takes care of her body, but she's not shallow or vain about it. She's financially independent but still soft and feminine. She has strong opinions but doesn't come across as aggressive. She wants a family someday but doesn't define herself by that. She's mentally strong but also open enough to be vulnerable. Read that list again slowly. Every single one of those qualities sounds reasonable in isolation. Together they form something that no actual human being can sustain, because many of them directly cancel each other out. You can't be fully professionally focused and fully emotionally present at the same time. You can't be fiercely independent and also deeply surrendered in love simultaneously, without serious internal negotiation. You can't have strong boundaries and also be endlessly accommodating without eventually fracturing somewhere. Psychologists have a term for this, role strain. It's the tension that builds when the different hats you're supposed to wear start pulling in opposite directions. But what modern women are dealing with goes beyond ordinary role strain. It's more like being handed a wardrobe of 20 completely different outfits and being told to wear all of them at once, every day. Here's what rarely gets acknowledged about this. When the standard itself is impossible, failure is built into the system. It's guaranteed. So instead of women concluding these expectations are unreasonable, the far more common experience is I must not be trying hard enough. The external contradiction becomes an internal wound. The system's impossibility gets worn as personal inadequacy. Think about that. The game is designed so nobody wins, but the player walks away believing she simply wasn't good enough. That cognitive distortion, mistaking structural impossibility for personal failure, is one of the most consistent roots of anxiety and chronic low mood in women today. So what actually helps here? Not lower your standards. That's patronizing and useless. The practical move is something therapists call values clarification. You strip everything back and ask, of all the things I'm supposed to want and supposed to be, which ones did I actually choose? Which ones feel genuinely mine versus inherited from outside pressure? 2 or 3 honest answers to that question give you something to stand on, a reference point. When the pulling starts, and it will, you have a center to return to rather than just spinning. What the phone is quietly doing to the brain. Imagine this for a second. Every morning, within minutes of waking up, you pick up a device and enter a space where thousands of women are showing you their best moments. The sharpest photos, the most romantic trips, the tightest physiques after months of disciplined work, the promotions, the glowing skin, the immaculate homes, the dream relationships, the thriving babies. You're still half asleep, your hair is a mess, your brain hasn't even fully come online yet, and you absorb all of that before you've had a single thought of your own for the day. Now here's the psychology underneath this. In the 1950s, a social social psychologist named Leon Festinger identified something he called social comparison theory. The basic idea is that humans naturally measure themselves against other people. It's hardwired. For hundreds of thousands of years, that comparison happened within a small community of maybe 150 people. People you actually knew, a manageable, realistic reference group. What smartphones did is detonate that reference group entirely. Now you're not comparing yourself to the women in your neighborhood. You're comparing yourself to the most curated, filtered, professionally lit version of millions of women across the entire planet. Simultaneously, before breakfast. The brain is not equipped for this. Full stop. And here's where it gets darker. The platforms showing you all of this are not neutral. They're not just displaying content randomly. The algorithm has one job: keep you engaged as long as possible. And research consistently shows that content triggering inadequacy, comparison, and mild anxiety keeps people scrolling longer than content that makes them feel satisfied. Satisfaction makes you put the phone down. Insecurity keeps you searching for relief that never quite arrives. So the design itself is calibrated, whether intentionally or not, to generate a low hum of not enough in the background of your mind. And multiple large-scale studies, including research published through the American Psychological Association, have found that this effect hits young women with particular force, not because women are more fragile, because the specific content women engage with, appearance, relationships, lifestyle, social status, overlaps almost perfectly with the areas where women already face the most cultural scrutiny. The tool is most corrosive in exactly the places where the wound already exists. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern worth understanding. What do you actually do about it? The just delete social media advice sounds clean but rarely sticks. What does work, and what therapists who specialize in this space increasingly recommend, is what I'd call structured access. You treat the phone like a powerful tool that requires intentional handling, not a pacifier you reach for automatically. No scrolling before your brain has been awake for at least 30 minutes. No opening comparison-heavy apps during emotional low points. And when you catch yourself in that familiar spiral of measuring your life against someone else's highlight reel, you do one specific thing. You name 3 concrete realities about your actual present life. Not goals, not ideals. Current, tangible, real things. That grounding move interrupts the spiral at the neurological level because the brain genuinely cannot run abstracted comparison and concrete. Present moment awareness at the same time. Old wounds, running in new situations. This next one cuts deep, and it almost never gets discussed in mainstream conversations. A significant portion of what shows up as anxiety, chronic overgiving, fear of rejection, or exhaustion in adult women's relationships doesn't originate in adulthood. It was written much earlier, in the first relationships where a young nervous system was learning the rules of closeness. Is love steady or unpredictable? Do I have to perform to be wanted? If I need something, will that need be welcomed or punished? Whatever answers that nervous system found early on become the operating code for every intimate relationship that follows. Attachment theory, built on decades of research starting with psychologist John Bowlby, tells us that early relational experiences form templates. These templates run mostly below conscious awareness. You don't decide to follow them. They just activate, and unless something interrupts that process, therapy, significant self-reflection, or a truly different relational experience, those early patterns tend to replay. Here's what this looks like in real life. Camille is 34, sharp, emotionally intelligent, professionally respected. In relationships, she finds herself drawn almost exclusively to men who are emotionally unavailable. She knows this. She can see it clearly from the outside, and yet the pull is almost magnetic, because on some level, winning warmth from someone who withholds it feels familiar. It replicates the original dynamic, the one where love had to be earned rather than freely given. Or consider Jade, who sabotages relationships the moment they start feeling genuinely safe. Security triggers more panic in her than conflict does, because security is unfamiliar territory. Her nervous system learned early on that closeness precedes abandonment, so she leaves first. Neither of these women is broken. Both of them are operating from deeply logical responses to their earliest experiences, responses that made complete sense at the time and now create chaos in adult life. Here's what makes all of this exponentially harder in the current dating landscape. Ghosting activates abandonment wounds with surgical precision. Situationships keep attachment systems in perpetual low-grade alarm. Dating apps, with their endless swiping and disposable attitude toward connection, create what researchers describe as devaluation through abundance. When you feel interchangeable, when connection feels tenuous and easily discarded, a nervous system that's already primed to question its own worth finds all the confirmation it was dreading. And then culture adds one more layer of cruelty. Women are told to be unbothered, detached, High value means needing nothing, so women with genuine, neurologically normal needs for secure connection learn to suppress those needs, to perform indifference, and suppressed attachment needs don't dissolve. They convert into physical symptoms, into chronic low-grade anxiety, into emotional numbness, into sudden crying in the car with no apparent cause. What do you do when you recognize this in yourself? You start by shifting the question. Instead of, why do I keep doing this, you ask, what was I originally protecting myself from, and is that protection still necessary? That reframe moves you out of self-blame and into genuine investigation. The pattern isn't a personal defect, it's an outdated strategy, and outdated strategies can be updated, but only after you've seen them clearly enough to work with them consciously. The labor that exhausts without being named. Picture an average Tuesday for someone like Renee. She's at work managing a team, which means she's not just doing her own tasks. She's reading the room constantly, noticing who seems off, smoothing tensions before they surface, calibrating her tone so her feedback lands without defensiveness. She's good. At this, she's been told she's great with people. Nobody mentions that it cost her something. She gets home and her partner unloads about his difficult day. She listens fully. She asks the right questions. She helps him arrive at a calmer place. Then she checks her messages. Her sister is spiraling about a family situation. Her friend needs to vent about her boss. And a group chat she's in has turned into a conflict that people are somehow looking to her to resolve. By 9 o'clock, Renee feels completely emptied out. Not physically tired. Something more specific than that. Like a battery that's been drained not by running, but by giving charge to everything around it. This is emotional labor. The sociologist Ali Hochschild first named this phenomenon, the largely invisible work of managing emotions, maintaining relational harmony, and carrying other people's feelings as part of daily functioning. It was originally studied in service workers whose jobs formally required emotional performance. But over time, research has made clear that this labor operates constantly in women's personal lives in ways that are deeply normalized and almost never acknowledged. Here's the specific damage this creates. When labor goes unrecognized, the person doing it can't point to it as a legitimate source of depletion. Renee can't say, I worked hard today, because nothing she did fits the conventional definition of work. So she just feels tired without a reason, which cycles back into that familiar internal story. Something must be wrong with me. Compassion fatigue, originally documented in medical professionals like ICU nurses and trauma therapists, is now showing up in ordinary women navigating ordinary connected life. The threshold has shifted. You don't have to be in a caregiving profession to hit the wall. You just have to be someone who absorbs, attunes, and maintains, which describes a huge number of women who've never once considered themselves. Caregivers by occupation. What's the move here? Making invisible labor visible is the first step, and it sounds simpler than it is. Start paying genuine attention to where your relational energy flows in a given week. Not to create resentment, but to create data. Because informed decisions are better than unconscious ones. You can't set a boundary around something you haven't measured, and once you see clearly how much you're carrying versus how much is being reciprocated, you can have real grounded conversations about redistribution, rather than just feeling vaguely resentful and not knowing why, looking for meaning in places that don't carry it. Here's the one that sits underneath all the others. For most of human history, meaning wasn't something you had to construct from scratch. You were born into a community that handed you a role, a story, a reason your life mattered within a larger whole. That structure had enormous flaws. Women especially paid enormous costs within it, but it also provided something psychiatrists now recognize as essential to mental stability, a sense of existing within a context larger than yourself. That scaffolding has largely dissolved, and in its place, consumer culture has offered replacements that look like meaning but don't function like it. Follower counts, productivity metrics, body transformation timelines, romantic conquest, professional status, aesthetic identity. These things promise the feeling of mattering. They promise significance, and women chase them, not because they're shallow, but because the hunger for meaning is completely real, and these are the options most loudly on offer. But here's what happens at the finish line. Tara worked for 3 years to reach a professional milestone she genuinely wanted. She gets there. There's a moment of satisfaction, sharp and real, and then within 2 weeks, that hollow feeling is back. She's already scanning for the next target. That's not ambition, that's a meaning gap, dressed up as a goal. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl spent years documenting what he called the existential vacuum, the psychological suffering that comes not from having a painful life, but from having a life that feels purposeless. His research, written from experience that most of us will thankfully never approach, found that human beings can endure almost any how if they have a strong enough why. Remove the why or fill it with shallow substitutes, and even comfortable lives start to crack from the inside. The data on purpose and mental health is now robust enough to be taken seriously in clinical settings. People who report a strong sense of meaning show measurably lower rates of clinical anxiety and depression even when their material circumstances are difficult. Purpose isn't a luxury, it functions more like a structural support beam. The problem women face right now specifically is that the legitimate sources of meaning, deep community, creative contribution, genuine service, spiritual or philosophical grounding, are increasingly framed as soft, old-fashioned, or insufficiently ambitious. Meanwhile, the hollow substitutes get celebrated loudly and constantly. So what do you actually do with this? Stop waiting for purpose to feel obvious or to arrive fully formed. It doesn't work that way for most people. What works is noticing. Pay attention to the specific moments when time disappears. When you're so absorbed in something that the self-conscious monitoring quiets down. Pay attention to what makes you angry in a way that feels principled rather than personal, because consistent moral anger often points towards something you genuinely care about protecting. Those signals are not decorative, they're directional. So let's bring this back to Natalie, back to that Sunday night dread, the unexplained tears, the feeling of being broken without a visible reason. She's not broken, she is a human nervous system responding predictably to 5 simultaneous pressure systems, impossible layered expectations with no room for being genuinely human, a digital environment engineered to generate inadequacy, relational patterns forged early and activated constantly, invisible labor draining her with no cultural acknowledgement, and a meaning-shaped hole being filled with things that don't fit. Any one of those forces would be legitimately hard to navigate. All 5, running at once, in a world that mostly tells women to push through and be grateful. That produces what we're seeing. The anxiety epidemic, the quiet desperation behind functioning faces. Understanding this matters because awareness genuinely changes the terrain. Not perfectly, not instantly, but you cannot find your footing on ground you haven't mapped. The moment you can point to the specific mechanism creating the static in your life, the comparison spiral, the attachment trigger, the empty tank after carrying everyone, you stop being completely subject to it. A gap opens, and in that gap, actual change becomes possible. That's not a small thing, that's actually everything. If someone in your life needed this framing, someone who's been struggling without the language to explain why, share this with them, not as a diagnosis, as a starting point for a real conversation.